Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon from wherever you are joining us today. Thank you for taking out time and coming to join us on a conversation on the TRIPS waiver. What are the updates and analysis of the recent developments around it? Today's webinar is being hosted by the Third World Network and People Health Movement. So in regard to the TRIPS waiver proposal, a lot has been happening in the past month. We are seeing more countries supporting the waiver, some fully, some conditionally. We're also seeing attempts at stalling the waiver text-based proposals. And yet we are seeing a sense of progress on the text-based discussions on the proposal. On the 21st of May, which is last month, the 62 member countries of the WTO submitted a revised proposal for the negotiation of the TRIPS waiver. And the TRIPS Council is slated to meet early next June, where the countries will be negotiating the text of the waiver proposal. To discuss what's happening, what is the state of play, we have two speakers, Sangeeta and Burju today. And before we begin, just a quick announcement for the participants. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A chat. So without taking much of time, I would like to start the conversation. And when we talk about the TRIPS waiver, we also look at what was the rationale behind introducing this proposal, and what we also would like to look at what is the current state of play with the revised text being submitted. So to discuss this, we have today Sangeeta Shashikant with us. Sangeeta is the coordinator of the Third World Network's Development and Intellectual Property Program. She has 15 years of research and advocacy experience in intellectual property and public policy matters, in particular on access to medicines. She monitors and engages with discussions at international organizations, including the World Trade Organization on Intellectual Property, and she has authored several papers and articles on IP and access to medicines. Welcome, Sangeeta. You can go ahead and share your presentation.
Thank you very much, Priyam. I'm happy to be on this panel, and thank you to everyone for coming on a Saturday to listen to the presentation. So my presentation, I've been asked to focus on the TRIPS waiver. I think the starting point of the TRIPS waiver is really to recall that when the pandemic started off, there were a lot of different promises of global solidarity that we heard, global public goods, equitable and universal access. And so that gave a lot of hope to civil society, to developing country governments as well. But instead, actually, what we have seen, not soon after, actually, since the pandemic, is huge disparity, right, between developed countries and developing countries, largely because the global demand has outstrips supply. And where there is supply, actually, developing countries have been priced out of access. So we see UNCTAD reported in October 2020 that for every $10 of COVID medical products in high-income countries, the middle-income countries have spent $1.10 in low-income countries. So this shows you that the huge disparity in access between developing and developed countries. So just to give some idea on diagnostic testing, which is really, if you want to identify the scale of the infection, if you want to understand the variants that are circulating, you would need proper testing happening throughout the population, where you see there is again huge disparity between the testing that we see in the developed countries as opposed to developing countries and LDC. And this disparity is also very much reflected in the rate of vaccination. You see that 16% of the world population, the developed countries, have vaccinated about 44% of their population, whereas developing countries that represent 70% of the world population have vaccinated 14%. And if you see within the regions, Africa, 0.5% have been vaccinated, Asia 2.2%, as opposed to European Union, UK, US, Switzerland. And even COVAX, which is supposed to deliver 2 billion doses in 2021, is struggling to get supplies. And to date, it has delivered only about 80 million doses of the 2 billion doses that it was set to deliver in 2020. So we have a situation currently where access is really dependent on limited, secretive manufacturing agreements. Most of these are contract manufacturing agreements, and they are essentially failing to mobilize existing manufacturing capacity and artificially limiting global supply. And where there is supply, it is largely pre-booked by the high-income countries. So when we talk of equitable access, we really need two elements: availability and affordability. And this really involves scaling up global manufacturing and diversifying supply. I think currently supply is very much concentrated in the hands of a few manufacturers. So we need to diversify and scale up global manufacturing, and especially mobilize the capacity that exists in developing countries. And I would say this would be one of the main motivation as reflected in the proposal of India and South Africa that they presented in October 2020 to waive certain provisions of the TRIPS agreement, patents, copyright, industrial design, trade secret for the prevention, treatment, and containment of COVID-19. Now, that proposal did not specify a specific duration, but it did state at that time, much less was known about this pathogen. It did say that until there is widespread vaccination globally and the majority of the world population has developed immunity. So it started off with 2 countries. Today, it's co-sponsored by 63 countries and supported by the majority of the WTO membership. There is a very strong legal basis for a waiver. It is provided under Article 9 of the WTO agreement, which allows waivers from WTO obligations in exceptional circumstances, which this global pandemic definitely is. And normally waivers is for a specified duration. Now, it is not unheard to grant waivers. In fact, there are many waivers granted on all the different obligations of WTO, including provisions of the TRIPS agreement. There have been waivers of Article 70.8, Article 70.9, Article 31F. So waivers have been granted, and there is precedent for it in the WTO. Just to mention that this waiver, it is a tool that is granted. It is not mandatory. It does not obligate countries to implement a waiver. It is an option that countries can have at the national level. So the waiver at this point is really a recognition at the WTO level that countries have the freedom to operate by suspending implementation and enforcement of intellectual property obligations for the purpose of containing COVID-19. The benefit of the waiver is really that it would allow us to avoid or reduce the procedural and administrative delays in addressing IP barriers. So normally in intellectual property agreements, you would have flexibilities. For instance, for patents, you have compulsory licensing. But compulsory licensing, you would then have to do, depending on the procedures in your national law, every country will have a different procedures, different requirements. You would then have to issue a compulsory license in the importing country, in the exporting country, and that would be possibly around product by product basis. So it can delay us addressing the intellectual property barrier. So a waiver at the international level, implemented at the domestic level, can actually avoid a lot of the procedural administrative delays in addressing intellectual property barriers. It can also facilitate collaboration. So if you look at collaboration, sub-regional collaboration, regional collaboration, South-South collaboration, international collaboration, the sharing of knowledge, technology, to the extent that intellectual property and monopolies are waived, it can actually facilitate that kind of collaboration, which is more difficult if you have to do it under a compulsory license regime, and compulsory license is normally granted in the area of patents only. But if you were to even apply in that context, every country, often region, different countries in a particular region has got different national laws that apply to it. So there are different reasons there where we talk of more collaboration at the regional level and international level. Actually, the waiver could play has a greater potential to play a role. It can facilitate economies of scale if you remove this intellectual property issue and support countries with insufficient manufacturing capacity. Currently, when it comes to removing, addressing patent issues across borders and supporting export to countries with insufficient manufacturing capacity, there is this special compulsory license regime, Article 31 bis, but it comes with different procedures and it has been declared quite difficult to use. So that is a challenge. There has been global support for the waiver from civil society experts, human rights experts, parliamentarians. In Europe, for instance, about close to 400 national and European parliamentarians have come out in support. Former heads of states, 110 representatives, US House of Representatives, and more recently, the European Parliament adopted a resolution. It was a HIV resolution, but included a para calling on the EU to support the TRIPS waiver proposal. So there have been discussions since it was submitted in October 2020. There have been a series of formal and informal meetings of the TRIPS Council as well as General Council. And I would say in 2020, the last quarter was spent really unpacking what the waiver proposal was about. So for instance, one issue that was raised was firstly raised by the opponents was whether intellectual property is really a relevant issue for us to address in the context of scaling up manufacturing and access to COVID medical products. And so the co-sponsors actually presented this document, W670, providing examples of intellectual property issues and barriers. Then Australia, Canada, Chile, and Mexico put in a paper raising 8 questions for the consideration of the TRIPS Council as to what are the specific challenge experienced by members in relation to COVID-19. And this was given, and a response by the co-sponsors was given in W673, addressing each of these 8 questions. And in the many meetings that were held in 2020, the opponents also raised a number of different issues specific to the waiver, issues and concerns specific to the waiver. And you can see a 30-page document was submitted by the co-sponsors, and I provided the link to the document. And this document actually summarizes, incorporates the intervention of the co-sponsors in addressing the very specific questions that were raised. So some of the questions were, for instance, the opponents were arguing that COVAX is sufficient. They have put in a lot of investment in COVAX and ACTA, the ACT accelerator, and so there is no need for a waiver. But I think the reality is that the COVAX, even if you give it money, it's struggling to get access to vaccine, and this has been pointed out very concretely by the Director General of WHO. Another point that has been raised is that intellectual property is an incentive and it plays a very important role. If you waive it, then we would not have these vaccines. But the evidence shows that actually in the area of emerging infectious diseases and including COVID, it has really been public funding that has driven R&D rather than intellectual property. And I think close to about 100 billion euros has been spent in investing in the R&D, but also in advanced purchase agreements. And we all know that the pharmaceutical companies are making billions of dollars out of this different advanced purchase agreements and the supply of vaccines. For instance, Pfizer is set to make between 30 billion, some say up to 45 billion. You have got AstraZeneca making, I don't know, 15 billion, 18 billion, including Moderna as well. So, these companies are making a lot of money out of this, the sale of vaccines. Then another argument that has been put forward is TRIPS flexibilities, that, there are already existing TRIPS flexibilities, so there's no need for a waiver. And here the co-sponsors have argued that the challenge we are facing, the scale of the challenge, requires us to take a measure at the international level and to give even additional tools to governments so that they can address the intellectual property barrier. So under the Trump administration, which in 2020, the US and the developed countries have been opposed to the proposal of the waiver. But under the Biden administration, there has been a shift, as you all have heard. On 5th May, the US government issued a statement supporting a waiver for protection of COVID-19 vaccines, and they said that they will actively participate in tax-based negotiations at the WTO. And actually, we have seen a shift in the positions that the developed countries have taken following the US announcement. So before I address that, on 21st May, the co-sponsors have actually put in a revised text. And you will see the two major changes that have been made are really in these two paragraphs, where they have been more specific with respect to the scope. It says they shall be waived in relation to health products and technologies, diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccines, medical devices, their materials or components, and their methods and means of manufacture. But it is again limited to prevention, treatment, and containment of COVID-19. And it does apply to these relevant sections, which is patents, copyright, trade secrets, and industrial design. And it's with respect to implementation and application and enforcement of these sections. So what is different here is they are more specific, because one of the criticism was that it was very broad, the previous language. So they have been more specific that this now applies to health products and technologies. And the South African ambassador at the 31st May TRIPS Council justified this on the basis that we have to see what is required, what are the tools required to contain COVID-19 pandemic. And across the board, there are shortages of not just vaccines, but therapeutics, diagnostics, reagents for the test kits, so, and all the different materials and components. And so we need to expand manufacturing in each of these areas. Another specific change that the revised proposal makes is with respect to the duration. It says that the waiver shall be in force for at least 3 years from the date of the decision. So it's a minimum period. And it says that the General Council shall review the existence of the exceptional circumstances. And if the circumstances cease to exist, the General Council shall determine the date of termination of the waiver. And this was justified on the basis that we are really dealing with a very novel pathogen, so many different uncertainties, complexities. Even if you look at COVAX, COVAX said that they would supply so many millions and billions of doses, and they have been unable to supply, right, because of the situations that different countries are facing. So it's a very unpredictable environment that we are in. And so we have to take that into account in determining the duration. And there's some changes, specific changes in the preamble in recognizing the different mutations and the need to, when we talk of preservation of incentive, but this have to be balanced with public health interest as well. So on the 31st May TRIPS Council meeting, the US again supported tax-based negotiations. The New Zealand has also supported an IP waiver for vaccines. Some of the other countries said that they would engage constructively. Some countries had raised specific issues with respect to the tax, which can be resolved during tax-based negotiations. The EU has been more difficult on this waiver issue. And they said that they are going to be submitting a proposal. And they have, in the last 2 days, or yesterday, they have issued 2 proposals. One is to the General Council, which is a much broader proposal with respect to their trade and health initiative. And then they have made a following proposal from the TRIPS Council to the TRIPS Council. So I just want to flag very quickly the proposal in the TRIPS Council. So they made 3 points with respect to compulsory licensing. One is that the pandemic is a national emergency, and so the requirement to negotiate with the right holder may be waived. But this is already allowed, the TRIPS agreement already allows that in situations of national emergency, there is no need to negotiate with the right holder. This is allowed by the TRIPS agreement. The second proposal they have made is that the remuneration that is given when you issue a compulsory license, it should reflect affordable prices. Again, the TRIPS agreement already allows for remuneration under a CL to be based on national discretion. The third point they make is, and this is in connection with the Article 31 bis mechanism, which is about supplying countries with insufficient manufacturing capacity. They say that when an exporting country has to make notification, they can provide in one single notification a list of countries to which vaccines and therapeutics are to be supplied or through the COVAX facilities. But again, this is already possible under the Article 31 bis mechanism. But importantly, the EU proposal does not address the limitations of the compulsory licensing system. Because when you issue a compulsory license, it's usually subject to a condition that is predominantly for the supply of the domestic market. But when you're doing it for purposes of export, you need to use Article 31 bis mechanism. And that mechanism has been subject to a lot of criticism. It has only ever been used once. BioLease, a generic manufacturer from Canada, has said that it would like to use Article 31 bis mechanism, but there have been notifications that has also been issued, but not much progress has been made for BioLease in Canada to export to low and middle income countries. So there are different limitations of this mechanism. So just to mention that actually what is being presented by the EU proposal is actually already allowed by the WTO TRIPS agreement. We don't see anything meaningful or new. It is really, if you like, old wine in new bottle. The status of the proposal is unclear, but it is quite obviously different. I know some media reports are saying this is an alternative proposal, but there's nothing alternative about it because it's quite different from the TRIPS waiver proposal, which is following a very specific process under Article 9 of the WTO agreement. And I think it's important to note that the EU proposal, especially the TRIPS Council, is only about compulsory licensing of patents. And again, there is nothing new there. Whereas the waiver is trying to address a more, taking a more holistic approach in addressing intellectual property barriers beyond patents and across the different products. The EU has come out very strongly in support of voluntary measures, but really, again, nothing meaningful because EU has failed to show any support or even to galvanize support for the COVID technology access pool of WHO, which is about voluntary licensing by manufacturers. In fact, they did not say anything when the big pharmaceutical companies rejected participation in CTEP. And the Commission itself actually has confirmed that the Commission itself has got very little information on what kind of agreements are being signed by this companies. So because all these agreements are actually signed subject to confidentiality, and they're all secretive. My final point is that there was a recommendation that was made by the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response. This was a panel established by, in the context of WHO, to recommend to WHO on how future pandemic preparedness and response should look like. And they have actually recommended that WTO and WHO convene vaccine producing countries and manufacturers to get agreement on voluntary licensing. And if this does not happen within 3 months, there should be a waiver. But we have been waiting for almost 1 year, and Big Pharma has rejected participation in the COVID technology access pool, which was actually developed 1 year ago. And they have not showed any willingness to actually engage in this process. And there have been so many different meetings that have been held by WTO and WHO, including one by the Director General of WTO on COVID and vaccine equity. And we have not seen much progress come out of that. And the WTO DG itself is now recognizing the need to expedite text-based negotiations and to finalize that process. So I'll just conclude by saying that, it is now time for us to really take some concrete action. We have seen a lot of hype around voluntary measures, but what we see is these voluntary measures are not really going to be contributing to equitable access, and really governments have to be in the driving seat to ensure that we are able to achieve equitable access. And I think the need is not just for 2021. This need is going to be there for 2022, 2023, 2024, because we already see developed countries already pre-booking a lot of the medical products, especially vaccines, right up to 2023 and 2024. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sangeeta. Clearly, there's a disparity between the developing countries in terms of access to COVID technologies, and it becomes more severe when manufacturing agreements and other agreements for sharing and exchange are in secrecy. And you pointed out that there's the need for diversifying production capacity, and waiver is, though not necessary for the countries to implement at national level, at the same time, it does give freedom to operate for the countries who want to enforce the waiver. We do have some questions, but I think we will hold on till our next speaker also gives a presentation. So while the EU's proposal is not addressing the limitation of the 31 bis mechanism, and with over a year of waiting, the other side is also arguing that intellectual property is not the ultimate barrier to COVID-19. To kind of most discuss about what and how the IP is actually creating a barrier to medical products, especially in terms of vaccines, we have with us Burcu. Burcu Kilik is a scholar, lawyer, and digital rights advocate. Her work is divided between digital rights and access to medicines. She directs the Digital Rights Program and is also the Research Director for Public Citizens Access to Medicine Program. She works with governments, international organizations, and civil society groups around the world and promotes their participation in rulemaking. Welcome, Burcu. Over to you.
Thank you. I have a presentation too. Let's put it here. And okay. Okay.
Can you put it on full screen mode? Yeah, it's correct. Thanks.
Okay. So, I mean, Sangeeta did a really great job. There isn't much for me to say, but I'm going to build on Sangeeta's presentation and talk a little bit about these IP barriers. We've been talking about these IP barriers for more than a year now, and finally people are hearing our voice. So as Sangeeta very well explained, the root of the problem is not the science. The root of the problem is business as usual approach. And this business as usual approach has been the dominant approach since the beginning of this pandemic. And I remember last year, this time when we talk about IP barriers, people were telling us, so-called policy elites, global health policy elites were telling us, no, for vaccines, IP is not the barrier. You guys don't know what you are talking about. It's not about the intellectual property, but it's all about the manufacturing capacity. But this is a chicken and egg problem. Why we don't have manufacturing capacity? Because of IP barriers. If we cannot address these IP barriers, we won't have enough manufacturing, especially we won't have enough manufacturing all around the world, because the manufacturing is you have manufacturing in India, you have some manufacturing in Europe. We build some vaccine manufacturing in the US, but how about the rest of the world? So speaking of IP barriers, I'm going to talk about the mRNA vaccines, because these are the vaccines everyone wants, right? They prove to be quite efficient, and and they are not only about COVID-19, because mRNA is a new platform for us, but it's not a new platform for the scientists. If you talk to the researchers who've been working on cancer research or other infectious diseases, they tell you that yeah, we've been working on mRNA for last 3 decades. But like mRNA became a reality for us because of BioNTech and Moderna. These are small I mean, they used to be small. Now I shouldn't call them as small biotech companies, but they were small biotechnology companies before COVID-19 who, and they've been working on mRNA platform, and they really believed in this platform. If you talk to, if you read the interviews with BioNTech and Moderna's like researchers, and you can really see that they really believed in this platform. And if you look at the scientific research articles before 2020, like people have been talking about mRNA as like a breakthrough for medicine, like you know, and it is the platform is very important, and it can be adaptable to many diseases, and it's very easy to scale up the production. So they were saying that this is the future for medicine, especially in developing countries. But well, as soon as mRNA platform proved to be efficient for COVID-19, it became the developed country issue. And like now everyone is like mRNA, only Europe and US, but not any other countries. So what's special about mRNA research? mRNA platform is the mRNA platform is protected by different patents, and there are many small like companies involved in this research, also the researchers. And patents are routinely used to protect the underlying technology, like and you can I'll show it to you. But apart from the patents, there are also trade secrets and know-how, and also undisclosed information, which are relevant for the mRNA manufacturing. So back in November, we did a landscaping for two of the mRNA vaccines, both Moderna and BioNTech vaccines. And this is these patents that we identified. And I have to say, this is an outdated research because it was in November. So now we are trying to update the patent landscaping, and there are more patents like than this. But like these are the patents we identified on mRNA platform that these companies hold. So, and then, you know, we went through their financial documents and the financial submissions, and something we realized, yeah, these companies, like, they highly value patents, but they also value their trade secrets. That's very interesting because, like, when they talk about the risks, because when you do a submission, financial submission to Security Exchange Commission for your investors, you will need to identify the risks. So one of the risks is like, I mean, they clearly see their IP portfolio as a as their property, and they clearly value that, and their IP portfolio includes these patents, but also trade secrets and know-how, like, and you know, and you can say that, like, I mean, these are the extracts that I cut from their Security and Exchange Commission submissions, and they say that, like, you know, we rely to trade secret and know-how, and it's particularly for manufacturing, and this is very important for us. And you know, and then you know, you have EU talking about patent waivers. Like, hello, you can really see that the companies are not only relying on patents, but they are also relying on trade secrets, and they identify any threat to their intellectual property, their patents, trade secrets, as a risk in their financial documents, and these are all their words. So that was the landscaping we did back in November. But something we realized when we were doing the landscaping with my co-author, there were like patents that we did the landscaping, but in their financial documents, they were also identifying, you know, they were talking about sub-licenses they had, and also some of the patent litigation going on. So we decided to do a network analysis, because as I said, this is a new technology for us. It's not a new technology for these companies and many of the researchers all around the world. And as you can see, there is no big pharma involvement because the tech platform is invented by University of Penn. And there was an interview with the creator of the platform back in I think it was in February, like in New York Times, and she was saying that for many years no one funded my work. So there were only few companies who believed in this research. One of them was BioNTech and the other one was Moderna. But they rely on each other's technology. So when you talk about compulsory licenses, and we know that back in like November, Moderna committed not to enforce its patents during the pandemic. Okay, but Moderna has 12 patents and it's not enforcing any of its patents, but Moderna has been in a patent litigation with Arbutus because Moderna has been using Arbutus patents, and then Moderna has a joint ownership of a patent with NIH, and then uses spike protein from NIH, and there's a sub-license between Script and Moderna. And I have to say, these are not in their patent documents. Like when you do a patent landscaping, going through the patent applications, you can't see this. We identified this going through their financial documents and working on compulsory licensing for many years on the ground with the countries. I know that like when you decide to issue a compulsory license, you check the patents, right? But it's very hard to identify. And this is not the full picture, because these are the ones that they are disclosed in their financial documents. And I'm sure there is more technology and more actors involved. And once again, this was in December 2020. Now we are updating this research and there are new players. Like Pfizer, you can see the Pfizer there, but it's because of its deal with BioNTech. But now Big Pharma realized the potential of mRNA and mRNA platforms, and they've been applying for patents. And this picture will look very different in a couple of months as soon as those patent applications are published. So anyone saying that, oh, countries should issue compulsory licenses, they don't know what they are talking about, because this is the reality. And it's not easy to issue compulsory licenses. Like how many compulsory licenses you will issue? And it's not easy. It's not easy to identify all the patents, licenses, and other technology that the companies use, because this technology has been collective. There hasn't been big players in mRNA until recently. So, and we've been hearing, as Sangeeta mentioned, like especially from Europe, voluntary mechanisms, they are really great, and countries countries should use that, and we promote voluntary mechanisms. And this is again Moderna's agreement with Lonza. Lonza is a Swiss company, and Moderna has a contract manufacturing agreement with Lonza. And I went through all the provisions to see what kind of technology transfer happening to Lonza, because in vaccine manufacturing, when we talk about contract manufacturing, it's not technology transfer. This company, Lonza, is just manufacturing the vaccines for Moderna. There is very limited technology transfer. Even then, Lonza is not allowed to use that technology. So how this helps to countries building their own manufacturing capacity? It's a big question mark. I mean, everyone talks about voluntary mechanisms, but people don't necessarily know the details of voluntary mechanism. And it's really hard for us to know because all these agreements are secret. We don't know the details of it. So this was the only one available, and we rely on this to a certain extent, but most of the agreement is redacted. So I have to say that. So the question is, people are perfect. As I said, the science has delivered. We have the vaccines, and many people living in developed countries are vaccinated. But we need to deliver it to the rest of the world. And what is the solution? So the solution is the TRIPS waiver. And I know that there's like, we've been working on TRIPS waiver for like 10 months now, like, and there is always a reaction, like when we talk about TRIPS waiver, because people blame us that we are not talking, we don't know what we are talking about. But it's like when you look at the, the landscape, you see that we need like a solution, a far-reaching solution. So TRIPS waiver is not a patent waiver, it's an IP waiver, and it provides legal certainty and full freedom to operate. And it will allow more countries to locally manufacture diagnostic and treatments, because the discussion is focusing on vaccines now. But for diagnostic and treatments, I mean, the scope of the waiver is not limited to vaccines. That's what the US said. But it's like the original proposal also includes diagnostics and treatments, and it's a different story for diagnostic and treatments, and it's not that complicated. And it facilitates knowledge sharing and meaningful technology transfer. It really gives the stick to the governments. So, and we've been hearing from many people that, but like how this will happen, like, because it's just only the researchers in the US and EU know this technology, not like and those people have been working in the US and EU. They can't go to the countries and teach them, hold their hands and teach them. Actually, that's not true. As I said, mRNA is not a new technology. There are like researchers who have been working on this technology for decades. And there was a very good article, and I encourage everyone to read it, with an interview with a Thai mRNA researcher, because Thailand is working on its own mRNA vaccines. And he was saying that this waiver will allow us to use technologies that are currently unaffordable or inaccessible to us, make our vaccine even better and cheaper. This is a Thai mRNA researcher's statement. So there is a clear like benefit to the waiver, because the researchers who've been working on mRNA have been saying this. They say that we need the waiver, we need to access to this technology. Yeah, and it's not easy, but it's not impossible. And as Sangeeta mentioned, the US supports the waiver, and I have to say, it hasn't been easy, and it's not gonna be easy going forward, because the EU is a very big problem for us now. But this is President Biden's statement from last week, and it's very clear that we have a support at at White House level, and both the United States Trade Representative and Biden believes in that. And thank you. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Burju. Thank you for discussing at length how the mRNA and the increasing fences around it has aspects of barriers, and how the waiver is an important aspect, where the researchers themselves are also saying that the waiver would help them access the technologies. And obviously the voluntary mechanism that the EU is suggesting, which also exists, like Sangeeta pointed out, in the TRIPS agreement itself, is not the answer, because the voluntary mechanism is clearly opaque and we don't know under what terms and conditions whether the technology transfer is actually taking place at all. I think we could open the floor for questions, and we already have a lot of them. So I'll read out the questions and you could pick up and answer. Either of you can choose to answer them. So the first question is from Joshua. Can you address how countries are going to implement the waiver at domestic level? What countries have changed their legislation to avoid the need, for example, for compulsory patent licensing, and doing so, have they avoided the need for any compensation of the patent holder? More importantly, how, if at all, have any countries sought to compel know-how transfers with or without compensation? quite a long question. I can repeat it if you want.
Hi, Priyam, would you like me
Either
to
if you
take
want
it?
to. Yeah.
Hi.
Sure. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Sangeeta.
So thank you very much for the question. I think, when it comes to national implementation, I think we should not be very prescriptive, because I think every country has a different legal system. They've got different intellectual property legislation, different mechanisms. And as I said, the waiver is not obligatory, right? It is a tool that countries have. So I think countries must have the freedom to decide how they want to implement it, the extent to which they want to implement it, the parameters of implementation. But I mean, my understanding is, if you look at the different measures that have been taken in the global pandemic, you can take certain measures through executive order as well, to the extent that that is possible under national laws. So I think that is one possibility that you have at the national level. You can take legislative action. I mean, if you look at patent laws, for instance, there are always exclusions to patent laws. And if you look at implementation of the LDC transition period for pharmaceutical products, you have got LDCs that have excluded pharmaceutical products from from the scope of the patent law. And even developing countries, when they were in the whole transition period, before they had to implement the TRIPS agreement, including India, they did exclude pharmaceutical product patents. So I think it is not unheard of having exclusions. It's kind of a normal part of the patent system. And I think in terms of implementation of the waiver, I think it's important that every country has got that freedom to decide how it wants to implement. With respect to know-how, actually, a lot of our discussion it's always on patents and access to medicines. We don't have sufficient discussion on trade secret protection and public health and access and the impact on scaling up manufacturing. So I think it's a very important area of discussion, and I think the TRIPS waiver has really got us thinking, how do we do sharing of know-how, and especially if the companies do not want to share. If you look in the context of the US, actually there is sharing of trade secret that actually the courts do require often in different court cases, but also in antitrust cases as well. More recently, Brazil, the Senate has adopted a legislation. The Senate has adopted the bill that in the case of compulsory license also requires the patent holder to provide information relevant for the production of that particular product. This is in situations of emergency. But I think when it comes to trade secret protection, one enforcer of trade secret tends to be our regulatory agencies. They receive a lot of the regulatory dossiers by pharmaceutical companies for the approval of therapeutics, vaccines, different biologics. And these regulatory dossiers contain very concrete information on the manufacturing processes, on safety and efficacy data. And so if we were to actually increase, lift this trade secret protection, increase greater regulatory cooperation and the sharing of regulatory dossiers, that could actually facilitate greater access to that information. So I think there are different mechanisms, and there could be many more mechanisms. And I think it is important for us to explore the different mechanisms that there are for the lifting of trade secret. I think the TRIPS waiver will facilitate greater discussion in this area. And we already see, like for instance, in the case of Brazil, they're already moving ahead with some of these mechanisms.
Thank you. Just continuing with you speaking about trade secrets, Lata has asked, assuming that we get the TRIPS waiver, how do we force the vaccine companies to part with trade secrets? I know you spoke about there'll be more conversation. And Lata is saying that we understand that IP is critical apart from dozens of patented tools that are used in mRNA, but is there a mechanism that can force the companies to share the trade secrets?
Yeah, so I'll give the same example. So you have got the situation in Brazil. They have a bill where the Senate has adopted that bill, and it contains provision that requires that the extent to which the CL is issued, that the patent holder will have to provide that information as well. And if you lift regulatory trade secret protection in the context of regulatory agencies, and the regulatory agencies should actually allow greater transparency and allow this information to be shared, right? And there is great value in ensuring that there is no duplication, for instance, in clinical trials, and duplication of efforts, especially in the context of a global pandemic. So here, I think lifting trade secret protection, allowing greater sharing of regulatory information could actually go a long way. And if the originator company is not wanting to be cooperative.
If I can add more on that, like, because trade secrets are like a black box for us, because we haven't thought about trade secrets until very recently. But in other sectors and industries, they are quite relevant, and it's a quite a new term for most of developing countries. But like, we know that there were legislative efforts in the US and the EU and some of the developed countries. And when you look at the trade secret laws, there is always a provision for public interest disclosure. And if the public interest is greater than the secrecy, like the countries can really force the companies to disclose the trade secrets. And this is not something new. It has been in trade secret law for many, many years. We just don't know it because we didn't really think about, like, access to medicines, trade secrets, or pharmaceuticals. But there are solutions that we can borrow. The problem is we need to think about those solutions rather than focusing on the problems. We need to focus on solutions, because since the beginning of this TRIPS waiver discussions, there is always this reaction: how about this? How about that? What are you going to do that? And it's just like, I always tell people, if there's a will, there's always a way. But we need to get this, like, get this waiver first, and then the legal systems are creative enough. Like there are, like, I know that there are many lawmakers, there are many, like, government officials. They are there to get creative and find solutions. And I think the laws already include those solutions. If not, we'll think about the solutions, but let's focus on the solutions. And there are ways to address trade secrets. Maybe this hasn't happened before for pharmaceuticals, but if you look at the other sectors, it had happened, and we can borrow, like, solutions from those sectors.
So Priyam, if I can just come in, I just remembered, actually there was early in the pandemic, if I may say, actually there was a case in Netherlands where the Netherlands authorities said that if the Roche were to actually share the testing reagents, they can scale up testing even faster. Roche initially refused to do so, and until it became public pressure was put on it. But more importantly, actually, the commission said they're going to start an investigation if they are not going to share the testing reagents. So in the end, Roche had to reveal the testing reagents. So I think competition law, it's another way of doing it, of getting companies to compel them to share trade secret. And of course, public pressure can also compel companies to share trade secret as well. So, and there are different mechanisms in the US as well. We see the court has got authority as well to perhaps step in and to require the sharing of trade secret.
Right, absolutely. With more regulatory overview, and also because we've not explored different aspects that can be applied to trade secrets, this is something that we have to also have more conversations on. Another question is from Pallavi. She's asking, will the waiver make it possible for drugs and vaccines to be manufactured in developing countries and LDCs? Do you think the problem lies elsewhere? this is one of things that you guys had already spoken about, whether the countries do have manufacturing capacities or not, and this has been responded to also in different. Yeah, Burji, you want to
Yeah,
respond to
I
it?
just very briefly, I mean, this discussion about manufacturing capacity, I mean, everyone is saying that, oh, we have limited manufacturing capacity. Yes, we have limited manufacturing capacity. But the thing is, like, mRNA is also a very new technology for us, and we built the mRNA manufacturing capacity less than a year, you know. So, and it's not necessarily relevant to vaccine manufacturing capacity because it's a different technology. And you know, it's as I said, this is a chicken and egg problem. We do have a limited manufacturing capacity because of the IP barriers. I mean, IP barriers, like IP is like one of the first issues we need to address. Of course, there are other things that need to be done, and but we can't get to those other like items if we don't address the IP barriers, because first the countries should have the freedom to operate and freedom to make decisions for their own realities. And so, you know, there is no clear answer, but this will help them to to take the necessary steps. Like without the waiver, without addressing, I mean, I don't really want to make this about the waiver, but without addressing the IP barriers, without addressing the monopolistic power of these companies, like it's impossible to talk about building manufacturing capacity because we relied on voluntary mechanisms. We relied on voluntary solutions. What happened? Like it didn't work. So now let's change our thinking. Let's give the stakes to governments and, you know, waive this IP protections, IP, and remove the IP barriers and see what happens, you know. I mean, because now everyone is thinking about manufacturing, and there is some funding available from some of the development banks, and there are experts like working on this. But in order to achieve that, we need to address the IP barrier. As long as those IP barriers are there, it will be very difficult.
Thanks, Burju. Taking the movement forward, Kapila is asking how can civil societies contribute to the joint effort demands of TRIPS waiver, and particularly the Indian civil society?
I think we got there because of civil society. I'll take the credit for all of us. Like, you know, I remember back in October when we first discussed this waiver, no one believed that. Like, what? But you know, few government officials from like India and South Africa, like they were the leaders, and a global civil society coalition. We work really hard. I mean, and I think we need to work harder now, you know, because we had, like, until now we had the India South Africa proposal, and like we were promoting it, and we managed to get the US supporting the waiver, and at least the text-based negotiations, because even that took like 8 months. But now we have the European Union problem, and we really need to address that problem, because European Union seems to be dedicated to oppose the waiver, and they came up with a proposal, and I don't want to call it as a proposal. It's a communication. There is nothing new in that communication, the EU communication, and it's not a proposal, it's not an alternative text. So we have a very, very major role to keep the focus on the India South Africa proposal. I mean, today I read that like the EU trade chief said that like they are expecting a proposal from the US, and they were like, you know, encouraging the US to make a proposal. That is like, that is pure like distraction, because the US made it clear that there won't be a US proposal. they want to follow the India and South Africa proposal. So the EU has been trying to shift the focus and prolong the discussion. And we've been hearing from more and more people, how about the ministerial declaration in December? That's not going to happen. That doesn't solve our problem. And I think that's the EU's that's the EU's plan. Drag the discussions, table an alternative proposal, which we call communication, not a proposal, and drag the discussions, and then and get a declaration, and everyone will be fine. No, that's not going to work. And I know the US and the other countries are aware of the urgency of the matter. So as civil society, we should really support the co-sponsors and also the countries supporting the waiver, and push them to keep the focus on getting the tax negotiation. I mean, starting the tax negotiations now. They haven't started it yet. And concluding tax negotiations sooner, better than later. There is a general council in July. That can be our target. But I see that Duncan has shared the Reuters news. The ministerial it's too late, and it's not an option. I know that it's not an option for co-sponsors. It's not an option for the US either. Like I can tell you from Washington, Washington is aware of the urgency of the issue. Sangeeta, you may have more to add.
Okay, thanks, Burju. We have a query from Nayanima. She is from the Print, which is an online news portal. She's asking, what are your views on the revised proposal by India and South Africa? Is it a much watered down version?
Yeah, so I don't think it is a watered down version. It is more specific. I think they were responding to some of the issues that perhaps came up during the TRIPS Council discussions, because one issue with the previous proposal was the main substantive paragraph was too broad, and now they have made it more specific to health products and technologies. They have also specified the duration. They've specified a minimum duration, as I mentioned in my presentation. So I do not think it is, if you like, a watered down version as was mentioned. But yes, they have to, as the negotiations proceed, they will have to maintain this scope and the duration. And I think there is effort by those who might be opposing or who might want to see a more narrowed waiver, and there's already talk about just a patent waiver or a patent waiver for vaccines. And I think we have to ask ourselves that if we want to contain COVID-19, is its vaccines in itself just sufficient? If you look at what the US National Pandemic Strategy says, or the EU COVID-19 Therapeutics Strategy says, or all the different strategies for COVID-19 says, it's never focused on just one intervention, right? You need a range of different interventions. You need diagnostics, right? Because if not, how will you assess the scale of infection and identify the different mutations and the variations out there? You need therapeutics, right? Because you know that there will be patients that will be hospitalized and that will be affected. You need vaccines. You also need PPEs. You also need ventilators. So, it's very difficult for us to say only one intervention, and all experts, in fact, in the developed countries themselves, say one single intervention is not sufficient. So I think maintaining a broad scope, and across this different broad scope, you have got different intellectual property that is involved. So just focusing on patents does not make sense, right? If you look at the Roche case, for instance, that I just mentioned in Netherlands, when it comes to the diagnostic about the testing reagents, it was a trade secret issue. The same thing with South Africa when they were facing issues with respect to testing reagents, again, trade secret issue. And where in Italy, there was a situation of ventilators where the ventilator valves were in short supply in Italy, and local engineers 3D printed the valves. That was actually a legal firm raised issues around potential infringement of copyright and industrial designs. So across the different technologies, you have a range of different intellectual property implicated. So I think when we look at, if our aim is really to counter COVID-19, we do need to have a proposal that does that. There is no point having a proposal that barely addresses the issue, and I think we are at a point where we cannot end up with something that does not work, because a lot of lives around the world depend on a situation that works, right? If you look at COVAX and ACTA Accelerator, it was presented as the solution, but COVAX itself is struggling to get supply. And it's only 2 billion doses in 2021, right? Even if you go by the 2 billion doses, it's not sufficient to bring the pandemic under control. In low and middle income countries, there are 6.5 billion people, right? And if you need double dose, it's 12 billion doses there itself. So that is not sufficient, but they've not even delivered the 2 billion. They have only delivered so far 80 million doses. And if you see, Pfizer is saying we're only going to give 40 million doses. And until today, maybe they have given maybe 1.8 million doses. So Pfizer is only saying 40 million doses. And out of the 3 billion doses they're going to be producing, they're going to give only 40 million to COVAX. And so far, they've only given 1.8 million doses. So there are really big issues we are facing in developing countries in terms of access. And so we need a proposal that addresses all of these different issues. And this is not just a proposal for developing countries, it's also a proposal for developed countries, because we see that a lot of the manufacturers like Moderna are unwilling to license, even where there's capacity in developed countries. For instance, in Italy, they have said we are not going to license because for so and so reason, right? Although there is manufacturing capacity in Italy as well. So I think this is a proposal that is about mobilizing global manufacturing capacity and removing, to the extent IP is a barrier, removing that barrier.
Yeah, if I can add a few notes to what Sangeeta said, it's very interesting, because at the end of the day, this is a battle of narratives, right? So for such a long time, pharma has called this waiver as a patent waiver, and it was very interesting to see all this op-eds coming from so-called experts, so-called Google experts, everyone became a manufacturing expert after 2 weeks of Googling. And they were saying that, but this patent waiver is not enough, because vaccines are more vaccines, patents are not relevant to vaccines. It's more about trade secrets and know-how. So they really ignored the broad scope of the waiver in terms of including copyright, industrial designs, and trade secrets. And when the India and South Africa revised their proposal, there was a frustration, and you can really read that in the industry-friendly publications. They were like, the scope is so broad, it goes beyond the patents, and it has been always beyond the patents. And then they were saying that this is not acceptable for the US. But as I said, and as I shared in my slides, President Biden and US made it clear that they support the IP waiver, not the patent waiver. And that is a very, very important point to make. The US supports the IP waiver, and no one has been talking about the patent waiver. So it has always been the IP waiver. That's that has been the pharma narrative. Now everyone is frustrated and calling the scope of waiver and the revised scope of waiver quite broad, because it's not patent. And I was like, you guys believed in this patent waiver for so passionately. Now we are frustrated. But that's one thing. So the word, as Sangeeta mentioned, I don't think that it's watered down. It's just adapted because there were concerns. I mean, you won't believe this, but there were concerns from entertainment industry saying that, wow, this waiver applies to copyright, and now like people will be watching our movies in Africa. There were discussions like that in the US. Like, and pharma was trying to get in the entertainment industry to on their side to oppose the waiver. So the waiver really clarifies the scope and and the term, because people were like talking about this is permanent removal of IP. Like, it's not permanent, it's temporarily. So I think the revised proposal, it incorporates all the concerns and all the, I will say fake concerns and all the criticism that have been raised by the opponents, because those were the points they made. And I think the co-sponsors did a really great job to to draft a text which is more clear. It has a very good scope, and it's not only vaccines, it also applies to therapeutics and diagnostics. And we know that the US position is waiver for IP on vaccines, but this doesn't mean that US hasn't been considering diagnostic and therapeutics. And I can tell you the Congress, like the Congress or congressional allies, are have a very strong position on diagnostics and therapeutics too. So in that sense, I think the revised proposal is a good starting point, and compared to the EU proposal, like and it should be the main tax for the text-based negotiations.
Thanks, Sangeeta and Burju. In terms of the counter proposal, if you want to call it, or the additional text that has been put up by EU, Daniel is asking whether EU is guilty of using international tools to prolong denial of access to vaccines. And secondly, can the WTO move forward on the proposal without EU support? I think Burju, Sangeeta is typing an answer, so maybe you want to go at it first.
Okay, yeah. I mean, let's clarify something. This is not a proposal. Let's not call it as a proposal because it's nothing new. As Sangeeta mentioned, this is old wine in a new bottle, and let's not call it as a proposal. Let's say EU communication. I'm strictly rejecting calling it as a proposal. Another thing is, like, if you look at the EU statements, since the EU statements made in the TRIPS Council or General Council since October, like EU always had that position. Compulsory licenses, TRIPS flexibilities, use it, and we don't understand why countries cannot use these flexibilities. I mean, EU has its own like special 301 criticizing countries using these TRIPS flexibilities. Hypocrisy, like it's hypocrisy. And or European partners published really good reports about that. Corporate Observatory Europe has a very great report, and I encourage everyone to read it to see to find out more about the EU's hypocrisy. And now, like, this communication, it's not an alternative text, but we heard that the EU will try to get other countries to support the EU position on the waiver. And so can the WTO, I mean, we need the EU, the decisions in the WTO are made on consensus basis. So we need EU to agree, and but I don't know how that will happen. Our main concern is EU will drag the discussions. We will spend another like 5 months until December discussing what are the problems with TRIPS flexibilities, why countries cannot use compulsory licenses. I mean, that's our concern, and we don't have time to lose because people are dying. And, you know, it has already been like 9 months since this proposal tabled, and we've been discussing, and now we have a good momentum, like with the US and other countries, 100 plus countries supporting text-based negotiations, and we have a good text. We should start the text-based negotiations rather than discussing why countries cannot use compulsory licenses.
Yeah, if I may add, Priyam, when we talk of the EU proposal, I want to just stress that, yes, it is a non-proposal in terms of what they are proposing. It's already there in the TRIPS agreement. But, their proposal does not take away from the waiver. We don't see it as an alternative proposal, because the waiver it has a particular process under a particular article of the WTO agreement. And it's a process that has been started. We've been discussing that for 8 months. And actually, a lot of the discussion in the TRIPS Council is already around the text, right? So there is no like formal way of entering the text space. If you like, I would say we're already there, because many of the questions, for instance, South Korea raised, is already on the specific text itself. Around implementation issues also, there have been certain questions. So I think we now have to, now that there's a revised text, use it as a basis for discussion to proceed with the outcome. And I think with respect to the EU, yes, ideally we have EU on board. And I think their civil society plays a very important role in getting EU on board. But I think if they are not on board, I think we have got the support of a large number of WTO members, and hopefully we can find a way out with the majority of the WTO membership, because we have seen a lot of hypocrisy from the EU. The EU started off saying these are global public goods, solidarity, all of this came from the EU global leaders. Chancellor Angela Merkel, all talking about universal access. Where is the universal access today? We have got the European countries vaccinating at speed, right? Fast track, whereas the rest of the world does not have this access. Where is this universal access, right? And you cannot talk of global public good if you do not lift the intellectual property monopolies around these goods. How can it be a global public good if, manufacturers cannot manufacture it, and there are legal barriers to manufacturing and to access? So I think there is a lot of hypocrisy coming from the EU. They talk about voluntary measures. They have not even gotten behind some of the tools, for instance, the CTAP, COVID Technology Access Pool, or even facilitated a lot of the entering of the voluntary agreements. So we are in a situation of artificial supply. And I think it is important, if we have the objective of coming out of this pandemic sooner rather than, a few years down the road, moving from lockdown to lockdown. I think if our objective, and I think this is where the US understands, there are mutations, there are variations, we need vaccination rolled out, not just vaccination, diagnostics as well, because we don't know what variants are out there as well, to the extent that there is limited testing. So I think the US understands that point. And even if you have your population vaccinated, these vaccines, we also don't know the duration of the immunity conferred, right? They say maybe it's 6 months, some say 9 months, maybe a year. So I think the global demand and it is a responsibility of the international community to bring this pandemic to an end sooner rather than later. And that requires us to deploy all tools possible to make that happen. And I think this is where we are. And I think we are fairly confident that hopefully EU will come on board. But yes, right now we see a lot of hypocrisy from the EU. And we do need to address some of these issues outside in the WTO, but also outside of the WTO.
Thanks, Sangeeta. Another question from Vatsala is, what would be the effect of, what would be bilateral investment treaties, what would be their impact on the effect of TRIPS waiver? So in terms of, even if the TRIPS waiver comes in, will the bilateral investment treaties
We had
to
this discussion
discuss?
yesterday with Phil for allies, because there was a question like about the US FTAs, and if you know the US FTA provisions, you know that they go beyond TRIPS, and they all include TRIPS plus provisions, and there are many countries which have already agreed on those provisions, and and we also received the same feedback from some of these US FTA countries. They are like, but we have the US FTA, like even if we waive the TRIPS, the FTA are there. But like one thing to keep in mind, US supports the waiver. So, it's just like, I think that's the phase 2. Like once we get the waiver, we will probably push the USTR to do like that kind of way to waiver for US FTAs. But in any case, like the US is the most problematic. US has been the most problematic. Sorry, US has been the most problematic player when it comes to IP policy. And now US supports the waiver because the US administration understands the urgency of the issue, and they fully agree that countries should have freedom to operate. So I don't really see, USTR going after those countries for the US FTAs. But with the EU, it's a big question mark, because the EU has disappointed all of us. So there, but the EU FTAs are not that far-reaching as the US FTAs. So maybe there is a hope there, but of course there should be a clarification from the EU. But let's say that if we get the waiver, I don't see the EU going after countries for the EU FTAs. That will be a PR scandal for the EU, because EU has been the good guy. At least in the beginning of the pandemic, we had the Trump administration and the EU. Now, like the US is the good guy, and we have the EU saying that, oh, we're gonna stick to business as usual pharma model, and we're gonna oppose the waiver and talk about compulsory licenses. And it has already, destroyed the EU's image, for many, many developing countries, especially our partners in Africa, are very, very disappointed with the EU approach, people in Africa. I don't see EU going after the countries after the waivers, but you never know. So, Sangeeta, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so actually, I would say, look, intellectual property are not absolute rights. Governments have a right to create and to take certain measures. And this is recognized very strongly in Article 7 and Article 8 of the TRIPS Agreement and the Doha Declaration. And I think this is the context of the waiver. And we see in this global pandemic, governments have taken extraordinary measures. And I think in the area of intellectual property, which is where you're addressing the manufacturing of all these important tools to contain the pandemic, I don't see why it is any different, right? So we are really contributing to bring an early end to this global suffering. And I think once there is agreement in WTO, it sends a very strong message to discourage any such action. If you look in the context of HIV, okay, we had 40 pharmaceutical companies after South African government for using the flexibilities. In the end, they realized it was a PR disaster. They dropped it. So I think if there is agreement at the WTO, it sends a very strong signal and discourages any such kind of action, because member states have agreed, right? We are in this global pandemic. And I think in the end, not everybody is bound by these agreements. And countries can decide how they want to implement it, the extent to which they want to implement it. They have that that freedom to decide how they want to do it within the legal system and the legal requirements or tools of that country. So I think I would just say in that context, I don't see that to be a very big issue with respect to the TRIPS waiver discussions.
Thanks, Sangeeta and Burju. I know we're running out of time, so just take one more question on whether there is scope for developing countries with sufficient manufacturing capacities to request for incentives under the TRIPS waiver. We're just gonna go ahead with what we have at hand.
So the TRIPS waiver is already a huge incentive because you're already creating that freedom to operate. Of course, governments can always give more incentives to manufacturers if they want to. The TRIPS waiver doesn't prevent that from happening. But I think the TRIPS waiver already provides that incentive for boosting manufacturing capacity, for collaboration, which is very important because there are varying levels of manufacturing capability. And we always spoke about South-South cooperation. It can actually open up quite a bit of South-South cooperation as well.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, the development banks, are very interested in local manufacturing now, so that will also once countries have freedom to operate, in terms of funding of that manufacturing, there are also options. Because at the end of the day, IP is also a risk for investors. No investor will invest his money in manufacturing if there are IP related risks. Once you remove those risks, that will also open the funding opportunities.
Thanks, Burju and Sangeeta. That was quite a round of questions and clarifications. I think we've covered a lot of base and have clarified how the communication is not a proposal and how we need to move forward with the text-based negotiations ahead. So with that, thank you so much for taking out time. I know we've really run way ahead of our time, and thank you for all the participants for coming in and asking their questions. So we will close the meeting, and all of you have a good weekend. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks for organizing. Bye-bye.
Bye.